Hello, and welcome to Cozy English Story. Today, I want to share a story that may touch your heart very deeply. It is a simple story, but it carries a powerful truth about love, family, and the quiet sacrifices that parents make every day. The title of this story is I'm 80 years old, I have a baby. When people hear this title, they often feel surprised. They wonder how an 80-year-old woman could possibly have a baby. But the truth behind this story is not about age or birth. It is about something much more emotional. It is about a mother. Margaret is 80 years old. Her hair has turned white, her hands shake a little, and her memory is not as strong as it used to be. But every morning she wakes up with one purpose in her heart: to take care of her baby. That baby is her 50-year-old son, Daniel. Daniel is not a child. He is a respected university professor. He teaches students, writes books, and lives an intelligent life. Yet inside their small home, Margaret still treats him like the little boy she once carried in her arms. She reminds him to eat. She worries if he looks tired. She waits for him like a mother waiting for her child to come home from school. To the outside world, it may look strange. But behind this simple routine lies a secret, a lifetime of sacrifice, and a love so deep that it will change the way you think about family. So take a deep breath, relax, and listen carefully, because this story may remind you of someone very important in your own life. The morning sun slowly entered a small, quiet house at the end of a peaceful street. The house looked old, just like the woman who lived inside it. Its wooden doors creaked softly when the wind moved them, and the garden outside was full of roses that had been planted many years ago. Inside the house, an old woman slowly walked across the kitchen floor. Her name was Margaret Hill, and she was 80 years old. Her back was slightly bent. Her silver hair was tied into a small bun. Her hands trembled a little when she held things, but her eyes were still warm and full of life. Margaret carefully placed a small pot on the stove. "Just a little more milk," she whispered to herself. She stirred the pot gently. The food she was making was soft oatmeal with honey, something simple and warm. Because in this house, Margaret had a baby. But her baby was 50 years old. His name was Daniel Hill. Daniel was not a small child. He was a university professor, a respected man who taught history to hundreds of students every year. He wore glasses, read many books, and wrote articles that people around the world admired. But to Margaret, none of that mattered. To her, Daniel was still her little boy, her baby. Margaret placed the oatmeal in a bowl and carefully carried it toward the living room. "Daniel!" she called softly. No answer. She walked slowly toward the hallway. "Daniel, sweetheart, breakfast is ready." A door slowly opened. A tall man appeared. His hair was slightly gray, and he wore simple home clothes. His glasses rested gently on his nose, and he held a thick book in his hand. This was Professor Daniel Hill. But the moment he saw his mother holding the bowl, his serious professor face suddenly softened. "Mom," he sighed. "You shouldn't carry hot food like that. What if you fall?" Margaret smiled like a mischievous child. "Oh, nonsense," she said. "I've been carrying food for you for 50 years. Daniel walked toward her and gently took the bowl from her hands. "You're 80 years old," he said softly. "And you're still my baby," Margaret replied immediately. Daniel couldn't help but laugh. This conversation had happened thousands of times, every morning, for many years. They walked back to the small dining table together. Margaret slowly sat down across from Daniel, watching him like she had watched him since he was a tiny child. "Eat while it's warm," she said. Daniel obediently took a spoon. Even though he was a respected professor, even though he gave lectures to large classrooms, in this house he became a quiet son again. He tasted the oatmeal. "It's good," he said. Margaret's face immediately brightened. "Of course it is," she replied proudly. "I know exactly what my baby likes." Daniel smiled again, but deep inside his heart, something always hurt a little when she said those words. My baby, because he knew something Margaret refused to accept, something painful, something that had happened many years ago. Margaret's memory was slowly changing. Sometimes she forgot small things. Sometimes she repeated the same story again and again. But the strangest thing was this. She clearly remembered Daniel as a child, not as a grown man, not as a professor, not as a 50-year-old adult. To her, he was still the little boy who needed warm meals, clean clothes, and someone to remind him to wear a jacket in winter. Daniel never corrected her. He never said, "Mom, I'm not a child anymore," because he knew the truth. Margaret had started to forget many things about the present, but her love for him had never faded. After breakfast, Daniel stood up and began washing the dishes. Margaret immediately protested. "Oh no, 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 no," she said. "Babies don't wash dishes." Daniel laughed again. "Mom, I'm 50 years old." "You're 5, Margaret replied firmly. Daniel sighed dramatically. "Well, then this is a very tall 5-year-old. Margaret watched him carefully while he worked. Her eyes followed every movement. She looked at him with the same gentle worry she had when he was a little boy learning to walk. "Daniel," she suddenly said. "Yes, Mom? Did you take your medicine today?" Daniel paused. "Yes, Mom." "Did you wear a warm coat yesterday?" "Yes, Mom." "Did you sleep well?" Daniel smiled. "Yes, Mom." Margaret nodded with satisfaction. "Good. A mother must take care of her baby." Daniel turned off the water and looked at her quietly. For a moment, he didn't smile. He just watched her. The wrinkles on her face, the fragile way she held the table, the softness in her eyes. This woman had raised him alone. She had worked 2 jobs when he was young. She had sacrificed her dreams so he could study. She had stayed awake during his childhood fevers. She had cheered when he entered university. She had cried when he became a professor. And now she was 80 years old, and she still thought he was a child. Daniel walked over and gently placed a blanket over her shoulders. "You're cold," he said. Margaret looked surprised. "Oh my." Then she smiled warmly. "Such a good boy." Daniel laughed softly. At that moment, the doorbell suddenly rang. Ding dong. Margaret looked confused. Who could that be? Daniel walked to the door and opened it. Outside stood a young woman holding a small notebook. She looked nervous but polite. "Excuse me," she said. "My name is Anna Carter. I'm a journalist." Daniel blinked in surprise. "A journalist?" "Yes," she said. "I'm writing a story about families and aging parents. Your neighbor told me about your mother." Daniel hesitated. Anna continued carefully. "She said something very unusual." Daniel crossed his arms. "What did she say?" Anna looked slightly embarrassed. "She said, 'There is an 80-year-old woman in this house who believes she still has a baby.'" Margaret's voice suddenly came from behind Daniel. "That's correct." Anna looked inside and saw the small old woman smiling proudly. "I do have a baby," Margaret said happily. Anna looked around the room. "But where is the baby?" Margaret pointed directly at Daniel. "There he is." Daniel closed his eyes slowly. Anna stared at him. Then she whispered in shock, "That is your baby?" Margaret nodded proudly. "My sweet Daniel." Anna looked at the tall professor standing in the doorway. Then she looked back at the tiny old woman. She didn't laugh. Instead, her eyes slowly filled with emotion. "May I talk with you?" she asked quietly. Margaret smiled warmly. "Of course." She patted the chair beside her. "Come sit. I'll tell you everything about my baby." And at that moment, Anna realized something she would never forget. This wasn't a strange story. This was a story about love that refused to grow old, and she had just stepped into the beginning of something truly unforgettable. Anna Carter sat quietly at the small wooden table. She placed her notebook in front of her and looked around the room carefully. The house felt warm, but also a little old and fragile. The walls were covered with photographs. Some pictures were black and white. Some were faded by time. Most of them showed the same little boy at different ages. A baby wrapped in a blanket. A toddler holding a toy train. A small boy standing proudly with a school bag. Anna slowly stood up and walked closer to the wall. "Is this Daniel?" she asked softly. Margaret looked up proudly. "Yes, that's my baby." Daniel, who was standing near the kitchen, rubbed his forehead and sighed. "Mom, those photos are from 40 years ago." Margaret shook her head firmly. "No, they are not." She pointed to one picture where a little boy was smiling with missing teeth. "This one was taken just last week," she said confidently. Anna and Daniel exchanged a quiet look. Anna quickly understood something important. Margaret's memories had stopped in a different time. Her mind lived in the past, in the years when Daniel was still a child. Anna sat back down slowly. "Mrs. Hill," she said gently, "can you tell me about Daniel when he was little?" Margaret's face immediately brightened. "Oh, he was the sweetest baby in the world." Daniel quietly walked into the room and sat down, pretending to read a book. But he was actually listening to every word. Margaret folded her hands and began speaking slowly. "When Daniel was born, it was the happiest day of my life." Her voice softened as she remembered. "I waited many years to have a child." Anna wrote quickly in her notebook. "Many years?" she asked. Margaret nodded. "Yes. I had Daniel when I was 30 years old. That was considered late for a mother back then." She smiled gently. "But the moment I saw him, I knew my life had changed forever." Daniel looked down at the floor quietly. Margaret continued, "He had big, curious eyes. He cried very loudly, too." Anna laughed softly. "A strong voice even as a baby?" "Oh, yes," Margaret said proudly. "And he always wanted to explore everything." Daniel shook his head slightly. "I think you're exaggerating." Margaret immediately pointed at him. "Babies should not interrupt adults." Anna laughed again. Daniel raised his hands in surrender. "Sorry," Margaret continued her story. "When Daniel was 5 years old, he loved reading books about space and dinosaurs." Anna looked surprised. "At 5? "Yes," Margaret said proudly. "My baby was very smart." Daniel tried not to smile. Anna looked at him curiously. "Were you really that interested in science when you were young?" Daniel nodded. "I was." Margaret leaned forward. "He used to ask me the most difficult questions." She lowered her voice like she was telling a secret. "One day, he asked me why the sky is blue." Anna smiled. "That's a classic question." Margaret nodded. "I didn't know the answer." "So what did you say?" Anna asked. Margaret laughed softly. I told him the sky is blue because it loves the ocean. Daniel finally laughed. That's not scientific at all. Margaret shrugged. It made you happy. Anna wrote quickly again. But then she noticed something else. Margaret kept looking at Daniel every few seconds, watching him carefully, like a mother checking if her child was safe. Anna asked gently, Mrs. Hill, do you ever feel worried about Daniel? Margaret's smile slowly faded. Her eyes became serious. I worry about him every day. Daniel looked up quietly. Anna continued softly. Why? Margaret looked at her hands. Then she said something unexpected. Because one day, I almost lost him. The room suddenly became very quiet. Anna stopped writing. Daniel closed his book slowly. Margaret continued speaking, but her voice trembled slightly. It happened when Daniel was 7 years old. Anna leaned forward. What happened? Margaret looked toward the window, as if she could see the past outside. That day started like any normal day. Daniel went to school in the morning. He kissed my cheek before leaving. Daniel's face softened. I remember that, he said quietly. Margaret nodded. He always kissed my cheek before school. She paused for a moment. But that day, something terrible happened. Anna felt a chill. Margaret's hands began shaking slightly. There was a terrible storm that afternoon, she said. Rain was falling very hard. Most parents came to pick up their children early. Anna whispered, Did you go to pick up Daniel? Margaret slowly shook her head. I couldn't. Anna frowned. Why not? Margaret looked down. Because I was working at the hospital. Daniel's voice became very soft. She worked double shifts back then. Margaret continued. I told Daniel to wait inside the school building until the rain stopped. Anna asked carefully, Did he wait? Daniel closed his eyes. Margaret's voice cracked slightly. No. The room became silent again. Margaret whispered the next words slowly. My baby tried to walk home alone, in the storm. Anna's eyes widened. What happened? Margaret's breathing became heavier as she remembered. The streets were flooding. Cars could barely see through the rain. Daniel's hands slowly tightened. Margaret continued. A driver lost control of his car. Anna gasped. Margaret covered her mouth with her hand. And my little boy was standing right in the road. Daniel looked down at the floor. Anna whispered in shock. Was he hit by the car? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Yes. The word hung heavily in the air. Anna felt her chest tighten. Daniel finally spoke quietly. I survived. Margaret nodded quickly. Yes, he survived. But her voice was full of pain. The doctors said it was a miracle. Anna looked at Daniel carefully. You don't look injured. Daniel touched his leg slightly. I had several surgeries when I was young. Margaret wiped her eyes. For many months, my baby could not walk. Anna felt her throat tighten. Margaret continued. I slept beside his hospital bed every night. I prayed every day. I promised God that if my son survived, I would protect him forever. Daniel whispered softly. Mom. Margaret turned toward him. Her eyes were full of love and fear. I almost lost you once, she said. Her voice trembled. I will never lose you again. Daniel stood up slowly and walked toward her. He gently held her hands. Mom, I'm okay now. Margaret shook her head. No. Her eyes were filled with emotion. A mother never forgets the moment she almost loses her child. Anna quietly wiped a tear from her own eye. Suddenly, she understood something very important. Margaret didn't just see Daniel as a baby because of memory problems. Part of her heart had frozen in that moment long ago, the moment she almost lost her son. To her, Daniel would always be the fragile little boy she almost lost in the rain. Anna looked at them quietly. Then she asked a question she didn't expect. "Daniel, why do you live here with your mother?" Daniel looked surprised. "What do you mean?" "You're a professor," Anna said gently. "You could live anywhere." Daniel smiled softly. Then he gave a simple answer. "Because she never left my hospital bed." He looked at Margaret. "So I will never leave her." Margaret squeezed his hand. "My baby is a good boy." Daniel laughed quietly. Anna closed her notebook slowly, but deep inside, she felt something strange. This story was not just about an old woman with fading memories. It was about a promise made between a mother and her child, a promise that had lasted 50 years. And Anna had the feeling that she had only just discovered the beginning of something much deeper, because the past still held secrets. Secrets that even Daniel had never told anyone. The afternoon sunlight slowly moved across the living room floor. Anna closed her notebook and looked around the house again. There was something very warm about this place. It was small, a little old, and slightly messy, but it felt full of life. Margaret was now sitting on the couch, knitting a small blue sweater. Anna watched her curiously. "Mrs. Hill, who is that sweater for?" she asked. Margaret looked surprised. "For my baby, of course." Daniel sighed softly from the kitchen. "Mom, I'm 50 years old." Margaret shook her head stubbornly. "You're still my baby." Anna smiled gently, but then she noticed something strange. The sweater Margaret was knitting was very small. It was the size of something made for a real baby. Anna looked at Daniel with a questioning expression. Daniel noticed it too. He walked slowly toward his mother. "Mom, that sweater is too small." Margaret looked confused. "No, it isn't." She held it up proudly. "It will fit him perfectly." Daniel gently touched the sweater. "Mom, this would fit a newborn." Margaret frowned. "Yes, my baby." Daniel rubbed his forehead. Anna could feel the tension in the room. Margaret suddenly looked around the house with confusion. "Where is the crib?" she asked. Daniel froze. "The crib?" he repeated. "Yes," Margaret said nervously. "The baby needs a crib." Anna slowly stood up. "Mrs. Hill, what baby are you talking about?" Margaret looked at her as if the answer was obvious. "My grandson." Daniel's eyes widened. "My... what?" "My grandson," Margaret repeated. Her voice became anxious. "Daniel, where is your wife?" Daniel went completely silent. Anna could see something change in his face. Margaret stood up suddenly. Her hands were shaking. "Where is she?" she asked again. "Where is your wife?" Daniel swallowed slowly. "Mom!" Margaret's voice became louder. "You told me you were getting married." Anna looked confused. "Daniel, were you engaged?" Daniel didn't answer. Margaret walked around the room nervously. "Where is she?" she repeated. Then she looked directly at Anna. "Are you the wife?" Anna's eyes widened. No, I'm just a writer." Margaret grabbed Daniel's arm. "Daniel, where is your wife?" Daniel closed his eyes. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "I never got married." The room suddenly felt very still. Margaret stared at him in disbelief. "That's not true," she said. "Yes, it is." Margaret shook her head. "No, no, no." She began pacing around the room. "You promised me." Daniel's face showed deep pain. Anna slowly realized something very important. Margaret was remembering a different moment in time, a memory from many years ago. Margaret suddenly turned toward him again. "You loved someone," she said firmly. Daniel looked down at the floor. "Yes." Anna's heart skipped a beat. Margaret's voice softened. "Her name was—" She stopped. Her memory struggled. Then suddenly, her eyes brightened. "Emily!" Daniel closed his eyes tightly. Anna spoke carefully. "Who was Emily?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Margaret smiled sadly. "She was beautiful." Anna looked at Daniel. "Was she your girlfriend?" Daniel took a deep breath. "Yes." Margaret nodded proudly. "They loved each other very much." Anna felt curious. "Then, why didn't you marry her?" Daniel's face became pale. He looked at the old photographs on the wall. Then he said quietly, "Because she died." The words landed heavily in the room. Anna felt a sudden chill. Margaret slowly sat down. Her confusion faded for a moment. Her eyes became clear and sad. "She died in the hospital," Margaret whispered. Anna looked at Daniel. "What happened?" Daniel walked slowly to the window. Outside, the evening light was fading. "She was a doctor," he said. Anna listened carefully. "She worked at the same hospital where my mother worked years ago." Margaret nodded slowly. "She was a very kind girl," Daniel continued. "We met when I was a university student." Anna smiled slightly. "That sounds romantic." Daniel didn't smile back. "We planned to get married," Margaret added softly. They were already choosing wedding rings. Anna's chest tightened. "So what happened?" Daniel's voice became heavy. "It was during the winter. There was a terrible accident." Anna held her breath. A bus lost control on an icy road. Margaret closed her eyes. Emily was inside. Daniel looked at the floor. She didn't survive. The room was completely silent. Anna felt tears building in her eyes. Daniel continued quietly. "She was 28 years old," Margaret whispered. "My poor baby." Anna realized something heartbreaking. Daniel had lost the woman he loved, and Margaret had watched her son's heart break. Anna spoke gently. "Daniel, that must have been very difficult." Daniel laughed softly, but it sounded empty. "Difficult?" He looked at the wall. "For months I couldn't sleep." Margaret wiped her eyes. He stopped eating. Daniel nodded slowly. "I didn't want to love anyone again." Anna asked quietly, "Is that why you never married?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." Margaret reached for his hand. "I told him life must continue." Daniel smiled sadly. "But I didn't listen." Anna looked at the photographs again. There were pictures of Daniel as a child, but none of him as an adult with anyone else. Anna suddenly understood something painful. Daniel had spent his entire life taking care of his mother. But maybe part of the reason was because he had nothing else left. Margaret suddenly looked confused again. Her eyes moved around the room. "Daniel?" she asked softly. "Yes, Mom?" "Where is Emily?" Daniel froze. Anna's heart broke. Margaret looked worried. "She should be here." Daniel slowly knelt beside her. "Mom." Margaret grabbed his hands. "We must invite her for dinner." Her voice trembled. "She likes chicken soup." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "Mom, Emily is gone." Margaret stared at him. Her mind struggled to understand. "Gone?" Daniel nodded slowly. "She died many years ago." Margaret's face slowly crumbled with sadness. "Oh," she covered her mouth. "I forgot." Anna quietly wiped a tear. Margaret suddenly began crying softly. "My poor baby." She held Daniel's face in her hands. "You loved her so much." Daniel hugged his mother gently. "It's okay, Mom." But his voice broke. Margaret whispered through tears. "You should not be alone." Daniel shook his head. "I'm not alone." Margaret looked confused again. You're not? Daniel smiled softly. I have you. Margaret stared at him. Then she hugged him tightly, like he was still a little boy. My sweet baby. Anna turned away slightly. She didn't want them to see her crying. The scene was so simple, but it was also so powerful. A 50-year-old man being held by his 80-year-old mother. Two broken hearts comforting each other. After a long moment, Margaret suddenly asked a quiet question. Daniel? Yes, Mom? If I forget you one day. Daniel froze. Margaret's voice trembled. If my mind becomes dark, and I don't remember who you are. Daniel's eyes filled with fear. Margaret whispered, Will you still stay with me? Daniel immediately hugged her tighter. Always. Margaret closed her eyes peacefully. That's good. Anna wrote one final sentence in her notebook, but her hands were shaking, because she knew something terrible might still happen. Margaret's memory was fading faster, and one day, she might wake up and look at Daniel like he was a stranger, and that moment would break both of their hearts. The morning began like any other. Soft sunlight entered the kitchen window. The smell of tea slowly filled the house. Outside, birds were singing in the small garden. Daniel woke up early as usual. For many years, his mornings followed the same routine. He prepared breakfast, checked his mother's medicine, and made sure the house was warm and comfortable. Caring for Margaret had become the center of his life. Some people might think it was a burden, but for Daniel, it was simply love. He stood in the kitchen cooking eggs when he heard Margaret's footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and careful. She entered the kitchen wearing a soft gray sweater. Her silver hair was slightly messy from sleep. Daniel smiled. Good morning, Mom. Margaret looked at him quietly. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then she smiled politely. Good morning. Daniel placed a cup of tea in front of her. Your favorite. She looked at the cup. Thank you. Everything felt normal, but something was slightly different. Margaret watched Daniel carefully while he moved around the kitchen. Her eyes followed him like she was studying a stranger. Daniel noticed it. Is everything okay, Mom? Margaret hesitated. Yes, of course. But her voice sounded uncertain. They sat down for breakfast. Daniel spoke about simple things like the weather and the garden. Margaret nodded politely, but she didn't say much. After breakfast, Daniel went to the living room to check the mail. A few minutes later, he heard Margaret calling from the kitchen. Her voice sounded confused. Excuse me? Daniel walked back in. Yes, Mom? Margaret looked nervous. I'm sorry, but... She paused. Daniel felt a strange cold feeling inside his chest. Margaret asked quietly, Who are you? The world suddenly became silent. Daniel stared at her. What? Margaret looked embarrassed. I'm sorry, she said softly. You seem very kind, but I don't remember you. Daniel felt his heart stop. Mom, it's me. Margaret shook her head slowly. I don't think so. Daniel forced a small smile. You're joking, right? Margaret looked even more uncomfortable. No. She looked around the kitchen nervously. Is this my house? Daniel's hands began to tremble. Yes, Mom, you live here. Margaret's breathing became faster. And you? Daniel's voice became very quiet. I'm your son. Margaret stared at him. My son? Yes? She looked confused. I have a son? Daniel felt tears forming in his eyes. Yes, his name is Daniel. Margaret whispered. Daniel! But there was no recognition in her face. It was like the name meant nothing. Suddenly, Margaret stood up quickly. Her chair fell behind her. No, she said, shaking her head. This doesn't feel right. Daniel stepped closer. Mom, please sit down. Margaret backed away. Don't come closer. Daniel froze. Fear filled his chest. Mom! Margaret looked terrified now. I don't know you. Her voice became louder. Where's my husband? Daniel swallowed. Dad passed away many years ago. Margaret shook her head violently. No! Her breathing became heavy. I want to go home. Daniel tried to calm her. You are home. Margaret looked around the kitchen again. Her eyes filled with panic. This is not my house. Daniel realized something terrible had happened. Margaret's memory had suddenly collapsed. The disease had finally reached its most cruel stage. Mom, Daniel whispered gently, but Margaret suddenly grabbed the edge of the table. Her face turned pale. Then she collapsed. Mom! Daniel ran forward and caught her before she hit the floor. Her body felt weak in his arms. Her eyes were half open. Mom, can you hear me? She didn't answer. Daniel grabbed his phone with shaking hands. Hello, please send an ambulance. His voice broke. My mother collapsed. She can't speak. Minutes felt like hours. Daniel sat on the floor, holding Margaret's hand. Her skin felt cold. He kept repeating the same words again and again. It's okay, Mom. I'm here. It's Daniel. But she didn't respond. Soon the sound of sirens filled the street. Paramedics rushed into the house. They carefully placed Margaret on a stretcher. Daniel followed them to the ambulance. The ride to the hospital felt endless. Machines beeped softly. Daniel held Margaret's hand the entire time. Please wake up, he whispered. At the hospital, doctors quickly moved her into the emergency room. Bright lights filled the hallway. Nurses moved quickly. Daniel stood outside the door, feeling completely helpless. Time moved slowly. Every second felt heavy. After what felt like forever, a doctor finally came out. She is stable, he said. Daniel exhaled deeply. But her memory condition has worsened. Daniel nodded slowly. I understand. The doctor looked at him with sympathy. You can see her now. Daniel walked slowly into the hospital room. Margaret was lying quietly in the bed. Machines quietly monitored her heartbeat. Her eyes slowly opened. Daniel stepped closer. Mom? Margaret looked at him. Her eyes searched his face. Daniel held her hand gently. Mom, it's me. Margaret blinked slowly. Daniel whispered again. Mom, it's Daniel. For a long moment, she just stared. Daniel felt tears falling down his face. Please remember me, he whispered. Margaret's lips moved slightly. She studied his face carefully, her eyes filled with confusion. I'm sorry, she said weakly. I don't know you. Daniel's heart shattered, but he forced a soft smile. That's okay. He gently brushed her hair away from her forehead. You don't have to remember. Margaret looked at him with curiosity. Why are you crying? Daniel laughed quietly through tears. I'm just happy you're awake. Margaret studied his face again. You seem very kind. Daniel nodded. I try to be. She asked softly, Do you have family? Daniel squeezed her hand gently. Yes. Margaret asked, Where are they? Daniel whispered. She's right here. Margaret didn't understand, but she smiled weakly. You must love her very much. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. Yes, he said quietly, more than anything. Later that evening, Anna arrived at the hospital. She had received Daniel's message. When she entered the room, she saw something that made her cry immediately. Daniel was sitting beside the bed, reading a story aloud. Margaret was listening like a child. He spoke slowly and gently. And the little boy said, Don't worry, Mom. I will always stay with you. Margaret smiled softly. That's a beautiful story. Daniel nodded. Yes. Anna stood quietly near the door. She whispered, Daniel. Daniel looked up. He smiled sadly. She doesn't remember anything. Anna wiped her tears. Not even you? Daniel shook his head. No. Margaret looked at Anna curiously. Who is she? Daniel replied softly. She's a friend. Margaret nodded politely. Anna asked gently, Daniel, are you okay? Daniel looked back at his mother. Then he whispered something so quiet that it almost broke Anna's heart. I told her I would always stay. Anna covered her mouth. Daniel continued reading the story again. His voice was calm and warm, but tears slowly fell from his eyes. And Margaret, the woman who had loved him his entire life, listened peacefully, like she was hearing the voice of a stranger. The hospital room was quiet. Soft light from the window touched the white walls. The sound of machines filled the silence with slow, steady beeps. Daniel sat beside the bed. He had been there for many hours. Margaret was sleeping peacefully. Her breathing was slow and calm, but her face looked very tired. Daniel watched her carefully. It felt strange. The woman who once knew every detail about his life now looked at him like a stranger. Yet Daniel stayed, because that was what love meant. Not leaving, not even when the other person forgot everything. The doctor entered the room quietly. Mr. Daniel, he said softly. Daniel stood up. How is she? The doctor sighed gently. Her body is very weak, and her memory disease has become very serious. Daniel nodded slowly. I understand. She may have short moments of clarity, the doctor continued, but most memories are gone now. Daniel looked at Margaret. She spent her whole life remembering me, he whispered. The doctor placed a hand on his shoulder. And you are doing the same for her now. After the doctor left, Daniel sat back down. He held Margaret's hand again. Her hand felt smaller than before. Fragile, like time had slowly taken pieces of her strength. Hours passed quietly. Sometimes Margaret woke up for a few minutes. Each time she looked at Daniel politely and asked simple questions. Are you the nurse? No. Are you my neighbor? No. Are you my doctor? Daniel always answered gently. No. She would smile kindly and close her eyes again. Daniel never told her the truth anymore, because the truth only confused her, but he stayed beside her anyway. That evening, Anna came to visit again. She carried a small bag of food. You should eat something, she told Daniel. Daniel shook his head. I'm not hungry. Anna sat beside him. You have been here for 2 days. Daniel looked at his mother. She took care of me for 50 years. Anna did not argue. She simply sat with him. Sometimes silence was the best way to show support. Later that night, Margaret slowly opened her eyes again. Daniel leaned closer. Hello? Margaret looked at him. Her expression was soft and calm. Hello? She said quietly. Daniel smiled. How are you feeling? A little tired, Daniel nodded. That's okay. Margaret studied his face again. You visit me often, she said. Yes. That is very kind. Daniel laughed softly. I suppose it is. Margaret looked thoughtful. Do you have family? Daniel hesitated. Then he said softly, Yes. Margaret smiled gently. They must love you very much. Daniel felt tears forming again. I hope so. Margaret's eyes slowly moved toward the window. The sky looks beautiful today. Daniel looked outside. The evening sun painted the clouds with orange light. Yes, he said quietly. It does. Margaret suddenly looked tired again. I feel sleepy. That's okay. Daniel gently adjusted the blanket. You can rest. Margaret closed her eyes. But before falling asleep, she whispered something softly. "Thank you." Daniel squeezed her hand. "You're welcome." The night became very quiet. Anna eventually went home. Daniel stayed. He watched the slow movement of Margaret's chest as she breathed. Each breath felt important. Each second felt precious. Around midnight, Margaret suddenly moved. Daniel quickly leaned forward. "Mom?" Margaret opened her eyes slowly. But this time, something felt different. Her eyes looked clearer, more focused. She stared at Daniel very carefully. Daniel felt his heart beating faster. Margaret whispered, "Wait!" Daniel held his breath. Margaret's eyes filled with emotion. She studied his face like she was searching deep inside her mind. Then something incredible happened. A tiny spark of recognition appeared. Her lips trembled. She spoke one word. Just one. "Daniel." The room became completely silent. Daniel froze. His eyes filled with tears immediately. "Mom?" Margaret's face looked confused again, like the memory had appeared for only a moment. But that one moment was enough. Daniel gently held her hand with both of his. "Yes," he whispered. "It's me." Margaret looked tired again, but she smiled softly. "Daniel?" she repeated quietly. The word sounded weak, but it carried 50 years of love. Daniel cried openly now, not from sadness, but from relief, because even in the deepest darkness of memory, one light still remained. His name. Margaret slowly closed her eyes again. Her breathing became softer. Daniel leaned closer. "Mom," he whispered gently. Margaret did not answer, but her face looked peaceful. Daniel kissed her hand softly. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Minutes passed. Then the machine beside the bed made a different sound. Long, continuous. The nurse rushed into the room. But Daniel already understood. He held Margaret's hand gently and whispered one final sentence. "Good night, Mom." The world felt very quiet, like time had stopped for a moment. Margaret's life had ended peacefully, but her love remained, forever. Days later, the funeral was small and simple. Friends and neighbors came to say goodbye. Many people spoke about Margaret. They said she was kind, patient, loving. Daniel listened quietly. After everyone left, Daniel stayed near the grave alone. The wind moved softly through the trees. He looked at the stone and smiled gently. "You called my name," he whispered. That was enough. He placed a small flower on the ground. Then he slowly walked away. But before leaving the cemetery, Daniel turned once more and spoke softly. "You may have forgotten many things, Mom, but I will remember for both of us." Time continued moving forward, but Daniel's life had changed forever. He returned to teaching at the university. He continued helping students. But sometimes, in quiet moments, he remembered the small kitchen at home, the smell of tea, the soft voice of an old woman asking simple questions, and the one beautiful moment when she remembered his name again. Because love does not disappear when memory fades. Real love stays, even when everything else is gone, even when the mind forgets, the heart still remembers. And sometimes, just one word can carry a lifetime of love. Dear listeners, many of us believe love is about big moments and grand words, but often love is much simpler. Love is patience. Love is staying. Love is holding someone's hand even when they no longer remember yours. If you still have your parents with you today, give them a hug. Call them. Tell them you love them. Because one day, you may wish for just one more moment, just one more word. Thank you for listening to this story. If this story touched your heart, Please support the channel by liking the video and sharing it with someone you care about. And if you enjoy emotional English stories like this one, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, Cozy English Story. On this channel, you can relax, improve your English listening, and experience powerful stories that touch the heart. Thank you for being here, and I will see you again in the next story on Cozy English Story.